So thank you, Ruth Astrid. It's really been a pleasure listening into the presentations here from the different speakers and over such a variety of topics. But I would like to pick up in particular on the narrative which is "Don't slow me down." And having followed the EU politics from some years, also spending about 4.5 years in Brussels, my concern is about the pace and the urgency of the transition. And one thing which is, in my view, have slowed down now the actions in the area of natural gas towards hydrogen and hydrogen from electrolysis is really the discussion ongoing on which production method should we use, and the lack of looking at the whole system, for instance, on the distribution and the end use of these kind of decarbonized fuels. And at present, there is a big debate in Brussels and in Europe about should we only look at one energy vector, which is electricity for production of hydrogen, or should we also allow for hydrogen production from natural gas with CCS? And there are different pros and cons on this. But is it really realistic to think that you could provide all that renewable electricity to serve such a huge demand, which we see that hydrogen has the promise to make for Europe? And I think these kind of discussions, they don't reflect the urgency and the transition on how different energy carriers can play a role over time. I mean, nobody disagrees that in the future hydrogen has to be produced from renewables. But how do we make the start of this market? How do we accelerate? When does the shift happen between the hydrogen from natural gas with CCS and the electrolysis? These are the kind of items I think we are spending too little time on, and that we are actually slowing down by the discussion on something which is not crucial for this transition to happen.
So who would you like to comment on that?
Well, I guess it's Jonathan Stern, because I read some of his pieces some years ago, and that was also a topic of one of the earlier energy transition conferences. And I'll stop it there. No.
Thank you. So I'm going to leave the word to Jonathan. But of course, if anyone else in the panel wishes to comment, just raise your hands and I'll try to keep track on the screen here. So Jonathan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've done a lot of work in Oxford on this. And I think you have to talk about individual countries. So we've particularly done work on Germany, where there's, shall we say, some reticence about moving forward with hydrogen from fossil fuels, particularly natural gas with CCS, partly because of the antipathy towards CCS. But we've struggled to see how hydrogen can make substantial progress unless we start with reformed natural gas with CCS. And this is exactly the point that you made, that we need to move faster. The opposite point, or rather if you like, an ancillary point, and I'm very conscious, I'm talking to Norwegians, and I think we need to acknowledge the fact that if it wasn't for the Norwegian government and Equinor, we really wouldn't have made hardly any progress on CCS within Europe. The progress that's been made outside of Norway and without Norwegian participation has been immensely disappointing. So we regard Norway as the leader in this technology, the projects that Al talked about, which have been going on for some time. But we need to move much faster. And I think we certainly don't need to rule out natural gas reforming with CCS. Probably in the countries where this is acceptable, which is mostly at the moment the UK, possibly the Netherlands and Germany, if that turns out to be possible, that needs to start there. Then as time goes on, we will see how the cost of electrolyzed hydrogen starts to drop, and hopefully just like other renewables, becomes more competitive. And also we'll see how the demand develops for hydrogen in the different sectors. I could go on, but perhaps I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. And I can see, Al, that perfect timing, Al. I just saw your hand being raised, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. We're fortunate to be in the leader of Europe's largest blue hydrogen project, that is hydrogen made from natural gas. But we're also a lead participant in one of Europe's largest green hydrogen projects in the Netherlands. And we can see very clearly that green hydrogen has fantastic potential. But right now, blue hydrogen gives you 95% of the benefit at 1/3 of the cost. And that, for a continent like Europe that is emerging from coronavirus with its economies badly damaged, blue hydrogen is the place to start. That will enable us to build the infrastructure that we can then use for green hydrogen in the future. But right now, green hydrogen costs 3 times as much as blue hydrogen. So we have to think economically as we move forward.
But Al, when you're saying that blue hydrogen is the place to start, and it's got to do with the costs, obviously, do you consider blue hydrogen and reformed natural gas with CCS as some kind of bridging solution that is going to be sort of phased out eventually once green hydrogen costs will be reduced sufficiently, or will both technologies be there for an unforeseeable future?
I think it depends on the timescale we're talking about. We certainly believe that in the long term, green hydrogen could well become cheaper than blue hydrogen. That is hydrogen from electrolyzing from renewable electricity. It could become cheaper. That's not proven yet, but it could, and we're optimistic that it will. But certainly there's a period of some decades where it looks like blue hydrogen will be cheaper than green hydrogen, and that's why we need to get started on blue hydrogen rather than waiting for the perfect thing that isn't yet as low cost as it will be. But overall, we're optimistic on both.
Poppy, I saw you were raising your hand now. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to bring in the demand side of things. I think everything that Nils and Jonathan and Al have talked about are plausible solutions to the supply side issue, but we haven't really touched on the demand. And I think the conversation that happens in Brussels in a very top-down way translates into a very different conversation at the national level, as Jonathan pointed out. So if we look at demand in Germany, for example, which is the largest user of any gaseous fuels anywhere in Europe, the civil society is really challenging the need and the narrative that hydrogen is, the silver bullets of all industrial development in Germany and so on. I don't actually know that, both civil society and consumers in the Netherlands are as accepting of hydrogen as the final solution when the country has a very radical decarbonization target and they indeed want to stop using gaseous fuels within 2030. And that leaves us with the UK alone, which is indeed one of the most accepting countries for hydrogen. So I would say that, again, going back to the paradigm of, having engineers and policymakers and executives at higher level dictating to people what they should want, I think a big part of the conversation has to be the demand. What do consumers, how can they be part of designing the future? And I think, the consumers have to be taken seriously and citizens have to be taken seriously.
Thank you, Poppy. And I'm very happy that you're drawing in the social elements here, because I would like for us to listen to or to hear from the fifth element in the panel. Ragnhild, I know that the topic of justness and fairness in the energy transition is important to you. And now that Poppy is drawing this in, how would you like to address this into the discussion, and where do you see the importance and the role of the consumers? Since we've been discussing the supply side for quite some time, what about the demand side? You're muted. You have to unmute first. Oh. It's getting late in the program now. Yeah, we can't hear you yet. That's strange. Maybe it's the same problem that Poppy had. I don't know if you can maybe unplug your wireless solution there. Okay. So we're just going to give you a couple of seconds to try to. No, we can't hear you yet. So you'll get some technical assistance, I think. Yes, good. So we're gonna give you that. And while you are trying to get back online, just one question from the well, there are several questions from the audience actually, and yes, a couple of them, I think they are more factual questions, so I'll see who feels inclined to respond to them. First of all, eliminate coal, gas and oil in Europe. How big is the need for solar PV and wind power? In other terms, how many Dogger Bank wind power projects do we need to cover it all? I don't know if someone feels inclined to reply to that. Maybe Al, maybe Nils? No? Nils, you're smiling. Maybe, yep, Al, go ahead.
I think without kind of going through all the numbers, what's clearer and clearer is that we need all of the above. And we need to dramatically ramp up wind power. We need to dramatically ramp up hydrogen. And I think Poppy made a couple of really good points. The first is that we need to simplify this whole conversation and get away from this idea of industry executives having one conversation and the general public having another. The second is that we need to recognize what consumers want. And I think otherwise we're going to get into a situation, for example, that we have in Germany right now, where we have lots of consumers wanting lots of wind power, which is great, but we have coal-fired power, which is scheduled to continue until 2038. So I think those are a couple of really good points from Poppy. I think the answer will be that we need every tool at our disposal, solar, wind, green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, to go through the energy transition.
Nils, I saw that you raised your hand, and so is Jonathan doing. And as soon as Ragnhild is ready, she's going to give us a little heads up on that. So Nils first, and then Jonathan.
First, about how much we need a lot, of course. At present, it's about 30% of the electricity which is produced in Europe, which is from renewable sources. And we need to decarbonize this fast. And if you look to the renewable breakdown of the different production methods, it's mostly hydropower, which has been there for a long time. And then you have very good additions of wind and solar, but they're still in the single-digit area in terms of percentage. But I wanted to touch upon this social dimension and engaging the demand side, because sometimes I see studies coming up now which are saying that we can do whatever with renewables in Europe, and then the control question is, given that there is no restrictions on land use, and how can you put that as a framework which you don't take into account? I mean, just look at Norway and the discussions we have for wind power, and we are not the most densely populated country in Europe. So I think that is a very important issue which is brought up here.
Yeah, thank you. Now I know that Ragnhild is back on again and the sound is working. You've heard us all along, so maybe you would like to sort of add to the final comments as well. Go ahead, Ragnhild.
Yes, because this is, a really important question when we come to this. The energy transition is how, you're talking of, so Al Cook was talking about, electrifying or switching down making climate neutral your production. And obviously that requires a lot of energy as well, because we know that each oil platform out in the North Sea has its own electricity generated from gas. So electrifying the entire Norwegian energy sector, for example, will require vast amounts of energy. And now, if we only look at Norway as an example, that in itself will then demand, if it's bringing power from the shore to the platforms, quite a lot of energy. And we've seen the conflicts that were just mentioned around wind power. And so if it's not then fully developed with offshore wind, then it's a question of how will this actually be feasible without then having major social impacts that will maybe, quite possibly mean that people lose the support for the energy transition because they see just wind farms popping up right in their neighborhoods in areas that are important to them. It's a question of Sami rights in vast parts of the Norwegian land. And so it's a question of like how practically feasible is this if we're doing it, if it's like, how do we make sure that it's done in a way that respects communities and people, and not least indigenous rights in Norway as well as the rest of the world? It's a big question, but it's like a major question that has been kind of reverberating throughout the day, really.
Yeah. Would you like for someone specific or in the panel to reply to that, or all of them?
Well, I think it's kind of addresses some of what Poppy Kalesi brought up, but also obviously I'll cook in terms of Equinor's
So we should
transition.
start with, we could start with Poppy, then Al, and I know that Jonathan probably would like to add something as well. So Poppy first.
I think this is a very interesting reflection, and of course it's a central question to answer. And I would like to consider this in conjunction with a question our friend from the public asked before, and discuss a little bit the now and the future. So when we plan energy systems, we typically plan them for use in 10 or 20 years' time. And the question of how many Dogger banks do we need, if we assume that in 2030 and in 2040, our buildings will be as inefficient as they are today, and that our use of energy services is going to be exactly the same as it is today, then that's probably a whole lot of Dogger banks that we need to cover our heating and industrial needs. If we plan and anticipate for a different type of economy and a different type of energy use in 10 and 20 years' time, this is probably a different calculation that we need to make. And to Ragnhild's point, I think the question of how to involve and making sure that the community needs and local society needs are taken seriously into account is, of course, a practical one. In countries like Norway, with a very high democratic culture and dialogue, it is, of course, a commercial need as it is a social need, because no project is going ahead without local communities having the buy-in. But I would say globally, we also have to think again in a 10, 20-year time. And the cost and benefits kind of way of thinking is not really reflecting the broader equation, which is, yes, there will be some costs in building renewables today, but can we actually calculate the costs of floods and lives lost? Even in the west coast of Norway, it's one of the best adapted regions in the world. And yet, a couple of years back, there was a horrible kind of flood in Bergen, and people lost their lives. This should not have been happening, So how do it is important that we expand a little bit the metrics by which we understand the energy transition and go beyond, as Al said, go beyond kind of the very technical parameters alone, and also start including human metrics.
Yeah. Thank you. Al?
Well, we talked about how Norway was a few decades ahead of much of the rest of the world in the 1970s on gas flaring, on emissions then. And I think the kind of debate that we're having in Norway today is very much a precursor of the debates that we're going to have across the rest of the world over the decades to come. And I think we've raised three dilemmas here. The first is, can we expect people to use less energy? And I think Poppy is right that potentially in Europe they will, but globally, of course, more people will use more energy at a global level, and we probably need to get ready for that. I think secondly, we've talked about the challenges over electrification of offshore platforms in Norway. You'll see we've announced the electrification of Troll West today, and we believe this is critical to keeping Norway at the forefront of those oil and gas production standards that Jonathan talked so well about earlier. And then we talked about the problem that people, frankly, don't like to have a great big wind turbine in their backyard. And I think more and more there's going to be an expectation that power generation occurs out of sight, certainly for wind turbines. And we believe in the future of floating wind. And we'll be doing that in the Tampen area in the North Sea, and hoping to do that more broadly in Norway's deeper waters, well out of the sight of people who understandably don't want their views to be obliterated by a wind turbine.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to comment as well, or should I give the word to Ragnhild, who has raised her hand, or do you have a short comment?
Can I just make one short comment?
Yes.
I think there is a danger that we become too Northwest European centred here, even in a European discussion. I mean, in Southern Europe, where you have much more solar capacity, the energy world looks very different. I think also we need to talk more about the costs of transition and the attitudes. If we talk about a just transition, you see it in the discussion of the taxonomy regulation in the EU, where the Central East European countries are objecting to the fact that gas is not being included in the taxonomy. And essentially what those countries are saying is, for us, gas is low carbon. And if you don't include it, if you're basically saying, no, we're not going to fund any more gas projects, then maybe we should just keep using coal in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, obviously, that's not a sustainable path. But you can see their point in relation to saying, well, you guys in Northwest Europe, you're phasing out your coal, or you've almost done that already. Now you're telling us you're not going to support gas, which is what happened in your countries. It's a shame that we don't have Radhika with us, because I think she was making some similar comments if you look at a country like India. So basically, we've got to be a little more sensitive towards both regional, national issues and costs.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a very fair point being made there. Ragnhild.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, bringing up the cost is kind of precisely where I wanted to place the question, because right now we've seen that with some of the UK offshore wind farms and obviously with the Hywind Tampen as well, there's a level of it's the state foots a lot of the bill for the development. So I'm just wondering, what is the kind of long-term strategy of when do you think that it will be operationalizable on a larger scale, so that it's not kind of the public paying the bill essentially, but it's actually the companies footing the bill for developing offshore wind farm technology?
That's a good question. And that is actually the final question that we have time for today, because now it is already 6 o'clock. So I would like for the panel to sort of briefly respond to it, and at the same time maybe make your own final remark. And now I see the camera is showing Poppy first, so go ahead for a final remark, and if you feel inclined, also give some reflections on the final question from Ragnhild. Go ahead, Poppy.
Yes, I should start by following up on Ragnhild's question. And I would say, yes, the technology development is happening by the companies, and this is the right place to go. But the technology without infrastructure, acceptance, and demand is nothing. So there is a lot of innovation and lots of inventions coming out of this country. But one problem that Norway has is that we are still struggling to scale up solutions and make them marketable. Why? Because few people are willing to buy yet. Maybe when policymakers in Europe create the frameworks that will create this demand, these technologies will be the solution. But nothing in and of itself solves the problem, and technology in and of itself is nothing without customers, without consumers, and without citizen and political support. So I would leave it at that as my final remark. There is no silver bullet. There is no, as Al and others previously mentioned, it's all a matter of collaborating better and more together because everything is needed. We don't have the luxury of time to start kind of turning against each other and picking up technology, or consumers. We need both.
Thank you, Poppy. Jonathan, you're next. And make it short, please.
Okay. I think the idea of companies paying is great, but companies have shareholders. The Northern Lights programme is being heavily supported by the Norwegian government. Essentially, in the end, there are only two types of people who pay: taxpayers and bill payers. And we have to decide which or both are going to pay these costs. The current generation is going to be paying for the benefits of future generations. My final parting shot is when we look forward to COP26, I don't really want to hear any more inspirational speeches by world leaders. I don't really want to have any more ambitious targets being announced. I want to know how much money they're going to spend now in order to get all of these trends on the way much more rapidly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I can see Poppy is giving you a round of applause there. Al, your final remark. Is it all about the money now?
I think a lot will be about the money that we're prepared to invest in all of this. I think the good news to Ragnhild's question on wind is those costs are coming down. The bad news is that you still can't use wind power to make steel, to make cement, to reliably provide heating. You need hydrogen for that. So this whole transition is going to cost a lot of money. I think companies have a role to play and a responsibility. I think consumers have a role to play and a responsibility, and countries do as well. So this is all going to have to be about an immense effort of collaboration, the like which the world has never seen before. That's what we need, and we need that to be collaboration on actions, as Jonathan said, not just targets.